Well, hello and welcome to the GFC podcast. My name is Matt, and up today on the podcast, notes from the cutting room floor. This past weekend, I preached on 1 Corinthians 7, and the message was titled Sex, Singleness, and Other Stuff. And as happens often with preaching, there's more to say than there is time to say it, and you have to leave stuff on the cutting room floor. I normally end up with more than 1,000 words of content that I just leave out for the sake of time. It's funny, I used to have the problem at times of generating enough content for sermons, and now most of the time the challenge is cutting and being concise. So today I just want to share some of that that's on the cutting room floor. And if chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians is about sex, singleness, and other stuff, what is some of the other stuff that we didn't get to? So here's a quick summary of what I'm going to cover in this podcast. I want to share a little more about the first century context. I want to share more about verse 1 in the complexity of Bible translation, more about the damage caused by an unhealthy view of sex, more about verse 14, which sounds crazy, more about the crisis that Paul refers to in verse 26, the troubles of marriage in verse 28, and the confusing verse 29 is just confusing. And lastly, more about what to do with tension in the Bible. Okay, so if you did not listen to the message, go ahead and do that first, because if you didn't, this will most likely feel like a random hodgepodge of information. But if you do listen to it, hopefully this provides additional insight that might be helpful. The main point of the chapter that we looked at, 1 Corinthians 7, is what Paul is saying in verse 17. And he says the same phrase 2 other times in the passage, saying, "Remain in whatever situation you were in when the Lord called you." This doesn't mean you never move or take a job or have kids or get married. What Paul is talking about is the disease of discontentment, of getting more focused on your situation and on changing your situation than you are on honoring God in your situation. The way I put it yesterday, 1 Corinthians 7 is asking us to be where our feet are, to be fully present, fully invested right now in the life that you have, because wherever you are, that is where you have the opportunity to know and glorify Jesus. So wherever you are, be all there. But the passage also addresses many different topics, from singleness to marriage to divorce to remarriage to sex within marriage. And so the first thing I just wanted to share about is a little more of the context of first century Corinth when it came to sexuality. So one commentary I looked at, it summed up Greek culture by saying, the wealthy men keep mistresses for pleasure, concubines for daily concubinage. I don't know if I said that word right, but that's what it says. And wives in order to produce children legitimately and to have a trustworthy guardian of our domestic property. The poor had fewer options, but there were also plenty of lower class prostitutes and brothels, especially in a harbor town like Corinth. And I said this early on in the series, but there's actually a term in the first century for becoming sexually immoral, sexually loose, for fornication, and it was called to Corinthianize. If you Corinthianize, that means you became loose morally. So that's what this town was like. And you also had in the first century, you had various philosophical attempts at the reform of sexual ethics in Greece and Rome, especially in the first century. So you had the Stoics, who were seeking to free people from the passions of the body. They basically condemned adultery, and many times they looked down on sex even inside of marriage. And then you had Gnosticism, which was all about true knowledge, gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge. It's all about knowledge of one's spiritual origin and your destiny. It's really a kind of a radical dualism. So it's separating the body from the soul, from the spirit. And so the emphasis with Gnosticism is separating people from their bondage to the body, either in stringent asceticism, you treat the body as evil, you even do crazy things to your body to punish it, or you go the other way, which is basically libertarianism. I mean, you treat everything that your body wants to do as morally indifferent. because it's not affecting your true self. It's not affecting your soul. Your soul is kind of shackled to your corpse in a sense. So the reason I bring that up is there is this tendency, even in the first century, and we see it today, to either elevate sex as the path to fulfillment and happiness, or to put sex down as dirty and unspiritual, or as in merely a physical appetite. That's a lot of what people believe right now, in our culture today, is that it's like hunger, like sleep, your desire for sex is just a physical appetite, does not affect your soul. And so the challenge for all of us and for Christians is to put sex in its place and to say, no, it's not merely a physical appetite. That's not what it is. And it's also not our salvation. It's not the meaning of life, and you can have a meaningful life without it. I love what Tim Keller says. He says, when we undervalue sex, we dehumanize others. When we overvalue sex, we dehumanize ourselves. So again, as Christians, we've got to, in our culture today, and this is hard to do, we've got to think rightly, wisely about how to properly value sex, to not undervalue it, to not overvalue it. Now, I want to shift and talk a little bit about Bible translation. So 1 Corinthians 7:1, it says in my translation that I normally teach from the NIV, "Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." I want to take you behind the curtain a little bit and just talk about the complexity of Bible translation, okay? Translators, you know this, you're listening to this, the Bible was not written in English. It didn't fall out of the sky for us in the 21st century. It was written in Greek, the New Testament. And so when we translate this into English, translators have to make at least 3 decisions about this verse. The first decision is this a quote? Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Is this a quote? There's no quotation marks in the original. So is it a quote or not? And if it is a quote, is it the Corinthians who are quoting, or is it Paul? I tend to think that it's the Corinthians who are quoting this because of how often Paul, in the letter of 1 Corinthians, he quotes them and corrects their view, because they had some messed up views in a lot of things. The second decision you have to make is, as a translator, is this a statement or is it a question? Again, the punctuation here doesn't help us, the way that the Greek is written. Is this a statement? It's good for a man not to have sex with a woman, or is this a question? And then thirdly, another choice is the actual Greek here says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. But many translators believe that the way that the word touch in Greek culture functioned, it was basically a synonym for having sex with someone. It's a little bit like in our world today, we say, talk about sleeping with someone. And what we mean by that is we mean having sex, even though those words don't mean that. But there's a debate about that. And there are some people who believe that, no, this literally means don't touch a woman. So my point here is that translations vary. I just want to read you just a few translations. The NIV says, "Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." The New King James Version, it says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." But in the New King James, there is no quote, right? Then the RSV, it says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman." But what you can't see via podcast, RSV has a period, and it takes the second part of that verse to be Paul is saying this. So Paul is saying, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, period, it is good, it is well for a man not to touch a woman." And then you have like the Good News translation, which says, "To deal with the matters you wrote about, a man does well not to marry." And there's a ton of other translations. So some of you are nerding out and you think this is cool. Others of you are super bored. I think it's fascinating because the point that I want to make is Bible interpretation and translation is not always simple. And this is helpful to remember. Again, the Bible did not fall out of the sky for us. We do our very best to interpret it in the most wise way possible, but it's complex. And I don't say that to weaken your confidence in your translation of the Bible, but to understand that your translation of the Bible is a translation. And as students of the Bible, it's just helpful for us to know that interpretation is not always cut and dry and discernment is needed. Okay, I want to talk a little now about the damage caused by an unhealthy view of sex. And I'm going to go into a couple things here. If you've got kids, my guess is if you're listening to this in the car and kids are around, you're probably already by this point, you've chosen to abort and pick a different podcast. But on this point, I want to point out some things that are definitely more PG-13. I shared how, in my sermon, I shared about how in many evangelical resources, the emphasis on sex within marriage is to the wife. And it's basically this. It's, wives, your duty is to fulfill your husband sexually. Some books say every 72 hours, even if you're pregnant, nursing, postpartum, on a period. And if you don't, it's like he's dying of thirst out in the desert. And your job is to fulfill him sexually. And when I say that, some of you are like, are you serious? And yeah, there are a lot. I could name books that have this kind of a teaching. And then there's other people who are hearing this and it sounds right. I mean, it feels like, isn't that the right thing? And what I try to do is point out in the sermon how when we take this approach, what I just described, we are actually doing the exact opposite of what Paul was trying to do with this passage, because Paul is replacing a male-centric view of sex with mutuality. And he is adamant that marriage and sex are not one-sided, and they require just as much yielding from a man as it does from a woman. Now, what I didn't have time to get into was some of the devastating results that an unhealthy view of sex has had. There's an author named Sheila Gregoire, and she did a survey of over 20,000 women based on peer-reviewed, evidence-based research on the topic of sex. And she talks about it in the book, The Great Sex Rescue, which is a really funny title. And always, by the way, as always, as a disclaimer, just because we cite or reference a book does not mean that we agree with everything in it. I have not read the book all the way through, though I agree with a lot of what I have read. But she talks about, in this book, again, peer-reviewed research is what this is based on. She talks about some of the common Christian teachings about marriage and sex and their effect on marriages and on women. And so she talks about things like the belief that all men struggle with lust. It is every man's battle. The belief that if you have sex before you are married, this means that you'll have less of yourself to give to your future spouse because a part of you will always belong to someone else. She talks about the belief that women should have frequent sex with their husbands to keep them from watching pornography. Another one is a wife is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it. And in this book, she shows how these teachings have had harmful effects. For example, if a girl grows up being taught that every boy she ever meets struggles with lust and objectifying women, not just her friends who are boys, but her friends' dads and her coaches, every male. If she hears that, even if she doesn't believe it, statistically, she will have less marital satisfaction if she gets married, and she will have more distrust of her husband and of men in general. This book talks about how women, if they believe that they must have sex to keep their husbands from watching pornography, those women report less marital satisfaction and less enjoyment during sex. They feel more used. The book talks about how women who are taught the obligation sex message, that you're obligated to have sex anytime your husband that they have less marital satisfaction and less enjoyment during sex. And all of these things are complex, okay? But they testify to the fact that a male-centric view, and really a transactional view of sex within marriage, is not working. It's not healthy. It's not honoring to women. And I mentioned yesterday, our natural proclivity, husbands and wives, with a text like 1 Corinthians 7 that talks about our spouse's duty to us, our natural tendency is to focus on our spouse, not ourselves. And I'm kind of making the case that a lot of Christian evangelical teachings, at least historically, they have put more of the emphasis on wives. But for all of us, when we read this, we tend to think about our spouse, not ourselves. And I think a great question, and I didn't get to this yesterday, but a great question for everyone to wrestle with who is married is not, how is my spouse doing in this area? Are they following Jesus? Are they doing what this text says? But the question to wrestle with is, in this part of my life, am I bearing the fruit of the Spirit? Love, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control. Am I bearing the fruit of the Spirit? Again, sometimes we think that it's our spouse's job to basically curb our sexual appetite or desire so that we don't have to practice self-control. And one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. And so part of, again, what I think we need to do as followers of Jesus is say, how am I in this part of my life being Spirit-led and putting the needs of someone else above myself? Okay, hard right turn into the next topic. I want to talk about verse 14, which sounds crazy, okay? So I know you may not have your Bible in front of you, but Paul has just said, verse 12 and 13, if you find yourself married to an unbeliever, that is not a reason to leave the marriage. And then he says this, for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Excuse me? What in the world is this talking about? So some believing spouses in Corinth were likely concerned that having sex with their unbelieving spouse would cause defilement. And Paul is saying, no, not only are you not defiled, your spouse is being sanctified through your marriage. And this does not mean that they are sanctified in a salvific sense, but in the sense of being made holy through knowing and being married to a believer. In other words, your faith is going to rub off on them over time and have a positive impact. This is the same thing that Peter says in 1 Peter about women who are married to unbelieving husbands. He says, if any of the husbands in those marriages do not believe the word of God, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. And this is so encouraging. If you feel, and you may feel today, that if you're in a marriage with an unbeliever or someone who doesn't share your interest in God, you may feel powerless about that. But the Bible is saying, no, you can actually have a profound impact on your spouse. And it's not through preaching sermons to them. That probably won't work. But it's through the way that you live. And I just think there's so much hope there. And I love that the Bible, by the way, addresses the complexity of marriage, because there are so many different situations and people are complex, and I love that the Bible speaks into that. So verse 26, I want to speak to this. It says, because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. This is Paul talking. So what does he have in mind when he says this present crisis? Well, here are three views, okay, that commentaries take on this. When Paul says the present crisis, he may have in mind food shortages in Corinth. There's actually, at this time, a lot of poverty and starvation happening, and so he may be referring to that when he says the present crisis. Alternatively, the phrase present crisis, it might refer to a period of intense difficulties prior to the return of Christ. It seems clear from the rest of Paul's teaching that he thought that the return of Jesus was imminent. So maybe he's talking about the groans of this world as we await Jesus coming back. A third option is, based on the words that Paul uses, this is not a present crisis as much as it is a present necessity or constraint. So Paul's advice to remain as you are is not based on an unusually terribly situation, but simply on the challenges of life in this fallen world. In other words, this is just more of a broad, because of this present crisis, because we live in a busted and broken world. And I think that's what's in view here. In verse 27, he says, "Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife." And this is where context is important. You can pull this one phrase out of its context and make it seem like you should never get married or even go on dates. Paul says, do not look for a wife. But the verse before this indicates, again, Paul is saying it's preferable from my perspective for you to remain unmarried. And then in the very next verse, Paul says, but if you do marry, it's not a sin. So again, context. Paul's teaching on singleness and on marriage throughout this passage is singleness is to be desired, but not demanded. And then in verse 28, Paul, he says, but if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life. And I want to spare you this. Again, as I said yesterday, this is hilarious that the scriptures just come out and say, hey, those who marry are going to face many troubles in this life. There's a quote about marriage from Mike Mason that I didn't get to share that I think speaks to this. It speaks to the nature of marriage as being hard. This is what he says: angering, humiliating, melting, chastening, purifying. It touches us where we hurt most, in the place of our lovelessness, dragging us into lifelong encounters, which at times may be full of boredom, tension, unpleasantness, or grief. Marriage challenges us to abandon everything for the sake of love. Marriage is really hard. But one of the reasons I like that quote is it's not just that marriage is hard and sanctifying and buckle up, it's going to be miserable, but there's something beautiful, and we know this. Those of you who have been married, and we know from the Scriptures teaching, marriage is beautiful. There's something about it, and part of it is what God does in us and through us in the midst of marriage. But the other reason that Paul, he basically says his preference is to be single is because of undistracted devotion to the Lord. Marriage and family, good thing. They also take a lot of time and energy. And even in certain seasons, they consume your life. There's a story that I didn't tell during the sermon, but I thought about it, and I'll share it with you, that when we had 3 kids that were 3 and under, it felt like nothing was mine anymore. Nothing belongs to you. With each kid, it's like, oh gosh, I have less and less of my own preferences and what I want. So, no time, no money, your house, it's not yours, your car, none of it, And I felt that as a working parent, a stay-at-home parent would have felt that times a million. But during that season, I remember inside of our bedroom, I had a closet. It was my closet. And the closet was barely big enough to fit a dresser in it. And I remember feeling at one point like I may not have anywhere else in this house that is untouched by children, but at least I have my closet. The floor was clean. It was unpolluted by kid craziness. And I say that joking. Kids are awesome, but you know what I'm talking about. If you've had multiple kids, you're not judging me. Those of you who don't have multiple kids, you might be. And one day I came home from work and I went to my closet to put my keys on my dresser, and there were kids' toys all inside my closet on the floor. It was just this moment. It just symbolized something. And I remember thinking, is nothing sacred? Does nothing belong to me anymore? And the answer is no, it doesn't. Just get used to it. But the point of the story is the emotional and physical energy required to raise a family, which again is a good thing. It inevitably pulls your focus away from possibilities that people who are single can have. Single people can display the love of God to all kinds of people, and married people can too, but they're more limited. And this ties to the mission of the church, which I talked about yesterday. One thing I didn't get to say is that the command in the New Testament for us as the church is not to be fruitful and multiply biologically. I had somebody after the sermon ask me about that. I said, doesn't God say be fruitful and multiply? Well, he does. But in the New Testament, the emphasis is not on biological multiplication. It's on spiritual multiplication. See, the New Testament says, no, you fill the earth with disciples, that we are, and all of us, we are to be involved in spiritual multiplication. Biological family is not bad, it's good and a blessing, but the vision of the New Testament, again, and this is where we're all headed one day, it's one multi-ethnic family gathered around the throne of Jesus saying, worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Now, verse 29, I've got a couple other things I'd like to share. Verse 29 is kind of a confusing verse. Paul says, what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as though they do not. Those who mourn as though they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it was not theirs to keep. What in the world is he talking about? His point here is that time is short, and this is important not just for Paul, but for Jesus. And it's interesting when these guys, when Paul, when Jesus think about the fact that we have limited time, they don't encourage believers to stockpile stuff. That's how some of us think about, okay, if time is short, danger is coming, I'm going to stockpile stuff. The encouragement here, and this is throughout the New Testament too for Jesus, it's in light of the fact that time is short, don't hold on too tightly to things of this world. It's like the opposite impulse that many of us have. Paul is basically saying to the Corinthians, don't get consumed by temporal matters. Don't get consumed by marriage, verse 29. He'll say in verse 30 and 31, don't get consumed by your circumstances, by your purchases and possessions, because the world in its present form is passing away. And he's not talking about the physical appearance of the world. He's talking about the system of the world, that the wisdom of the world, it's temporal and it's limited. And so you can't order your lives based on that. Now, lastly, let's talk just briefly about tension in the Bible. So Paul's teachings here about singleness and marriage, they seem to contradict Proverbs and other places in the Bible about marriage and singleness. I mean, Proverbs says, he who finds a wife finds a blessing. And 1 Corinthians 7 seems to say, he who finds a wife finds a problem. Or at the very least, hey, you're not going to be quite as spiritual. Genesis 2, God puts Adam and Eve together and he blesses their union. Psalms talk about the blessing of family. But Paul seems to say in 1 Corinthians 7 that family actually takes you away from focusing on the Lord. So how do we reconcile these two ideas? And part of what we have to do as students of Scripture is allow there to be tension where there is tension, to not clean it up. And what some people do is they want to ignore or minimize places like 1 Corinthians 7. I think a lot of the evangelical church does that because, again, if you just look at it, you'd say the church has championed marriage way more than they've championed singleness. But we have to let the Bible speak for itself. And it says both. It says marriage is incredible. What a blessing from God. And yes, God has designed us in a sense for that kind of intimacy. And at the same time, Jesus wasn't married. And our hope, our source of fulfillment, it's not in marriage, it's in God. And so God seems pretty comfortable with leaving tension in the Bible, contradiction. And if we don't realize this, we're going to have a hard time, not just with this, but the whole Bible. I mean, if you look at Proverbs, for example, I just want to show you two Proverbs. Proverbs 26, verse 4 says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him." So don't answer a fool according to his folly. The very next verse, you know what it says? "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." It literally says the opposite of the prior verse. One verse says, don't do it. The next verse says, do it. And just another example, you have different kinds of wisdom literature in the Bible. You have Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and oftentimes their perspectives, they clash. And they even feel like they contradict each other. I mean, Proverbs is really, it's about being wise, fearing God. And the essence of Proverbs is, if you fear God and you do the right thing, things will work out for you. If you're stupid and do evil, then things will go bad for you and you'll die young. That's a summary of Proverbs. And so, a couple examples. Proverbs will say, the wicked will be snuffed out. The plans of the diligent lead to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes to poverty. Train up a child in the way he should go. Many of you parents, you know this. Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. But Ecclesiastes seems to say the opposite. If you know the book of Ecclesiastes essentially says, sometimes it'll work out for you. Sometimes it won't. It's not a guaranteed system. Death and chance happen to us all. So really, what's the point? This is kind of absurd. Ecclesiastes looks at Proverbs and says, listen, I know a guy who was a great dad, and he trained up his child in the way he should go. And you know what? The kid ran away from God and hates his dad now. Or, Ecclesiastes might say, I know someone who worked extremely hard, saved all of their money. They were diligent. They gave to the poor and to the church. And then his company went belly up and he lost everything. And so it's those realities that leads Ecclesiastes to say meaningless, it's all meaningless. And what I'm trying to say is we need both of these perspectives. We need what Proverbs has to say, that generally this is how life works. And if you go against the grain of the universe, how God has ordained wisdom to work, you're going to get splinters. But on the other hand, if you make Proverbs into an airtight formula for how you live and you'll get blessings, that's not going to work either, because we live in a broken world and we need both of those perspectives. So there's tension in the Bible. And this is why we need to be wise as we understand and apply the Bible, to look at it in its context, to look at the whole of Scripture. And so, again, to the point I'm talking about, does God value singleness or marriage? The answer is yes. And the answer is really that, like we talked about. Both singleness and marriage are about something bigger. And as a reminder of that, let me just share the way that I ended the sermon yesterday. 1 Corinthians 7, okay, this text. God is not concerned with the question, why am I blank? Why am I single? Why am I married? God is concerned with this question, for what purpose? For what purpose? And the answer is to know and glorify Jesus. So singleness is a great time to seek the Lord, to follow our single Savior, to give undistracted devotion to Him, to display God's love to the world, to say, God, you're all I need. And marriage is a great time to seek the Lord, to learn in a deeper way what it means to die to yourself, to, if you have kids, embody the grace of God in how you treat your spouse, to put God's covenant-keeping love on display to the world through faithfulness to each other, and to say, God, you're all I need, and I seek you. See, God is the end, not the means. That's what singleness and marriage are. They're both ways that we can offer Him all that we are, to love Him as we give our lives away to those around us. They're both means to the end of knowing Him and bringing Him glory. So for us, listen, today even, wherever you are, if you're single, if you're married, if you're 15 or 85, the challenge for you and for me is to be where our feet are. And I hope you enjoyed this podcast with some notes from the cutting room floor. If you want to listen again to the full message from Sunday, you can find that on this podcast feed or at gfcnow.com/messages. And I just want to say thanks to your generosity. GFC continues to provide essential aid to Mountain View families through the weekend backpack food program. But one of the challenges we're facing is the demand for weekend food has nearly doubled since last year. So as part of our October Love in Action Give, we are asking for 2 specific canned food items to meet the growing need. So right now, as I am recording this, we are in need of 2,000 cans of Chef Boyardee and 2,000 cans of Beanie Weenies. And I just want to ask you to consider how you can help with that by bringing donations to GFC during the office hours this week or this coming Sunday. And you can find out more details about all that, and even how to buy online. If you want to buy some of those items online and have them sent to the church, you can find out all of that at gfcnow.com/loveinaction. And lastly, we'd love to know what you thought about this podcast. We are exploring and trying different things with this podcast. We want it to be an extension of our teaching ministry here. We want it to help us with our mission and our vision, and we want it to be a blessing to you. So we would love to hear any comments or questions you have, and you can send those to podcast@gfcnow.com. And if you would take 30 seconds to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review, which will help people find the podcast easier and hear the content. Have a great week.